Deloitte for corporate governance and public policy. And it's an honor for me to be here and to be celebrating with you Crissair's 10th anniversary. You may be asking why you are arranged in an unusual formation. It is because we are attempting to do something different today. We're going to have a panel, a discussion, and then we want to hear from you. We're going to have two breakouts. We want to ask you a few questions. You'll talk amongst yourselves, and then you'll report back. So we are going to get you involved in the discussion too. So it's my job to welcome you, to introduce the panelists, which I'll do in a moment. But first, I also want to help set the scene and share with you some of the topics that I hope we will be addressing, that our panelists will be talking about today, each from their own perspective. And just so to get right into it, I'm going to walk you through some topics that I hope will be entertaining, at least in terms of the pictures we have for you on the screen. We'll start, I hope, by talking a little bit about how boards have changed over the years. This is a picture of a North American board of directors from 1953. Can anyone guess what board this might be? It's an old company that, in fact, is still around today. I heard General. Very good. Give that woman a prize. That is General Electric. So you can see that boards back in the 1950s were very similar. We have all men, older men. There's not a lot in front of them. There's no iPad. There's no documents, really. At that time, North American boards and many boards didn't do very much apart from show up at board meetings, spend a little bit of time approving things, and then they might go play some golf. Things we hope have changed. Here's a picture of a board from today. Can anyone guess what board this might be? This is close. It is indeed a California social media company, but it is not Snapchat. This is the Twitter board from a few years ago. So, looking at these two pictures, not in some ways a lot has changed. They're active. They're independent. They're outside. But they seem to be just as allergic to women as they were in the 50s. Now, to be fair, Twitter has since appointed 2 women to their board, so we shouldn't pick on Twitter. But we're going to talk today a little bit about diversity and women and other minorities on boards, and does that help? How do we change things? We'll also talk about independent directors. And if you'll indulge me, I'll share I have lots of stories I like to tell. My very quick story about independent directors that has to do with, are independent directors really the solution for Latin America or for companies where you have controlling shareholders? I can tell you a story about a time I worked in Spain with a company that was a very old company. They'd been around for hundreds of years. They were very proud that they had received their New York Stock Exchange listing that year. I met the chairman. He takes me on a tour of his boardroom. And in the boardroom, they have these old paintings, oil paintings of people that ran the company 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And the chairman is showing me each painting. And at the end, he sort of walks me through each one. And he points to this last painting of this old man. He's been dead for 50 years, and he says, "This is the grandfather of our independent director." This makes no sense. As an American, I think, how can he be independent? But the reality was this was a company that was controlled by 2 large banks. Each bank held 30% of the shares, and surprise, surprise, the banks did not always act in the best interest of the rest of the shareholders. And surprise, surprise, it was the chairman that I was meeting who was the son, the grandson, the great-grandson, who was the guarantor of this company's independence. He was not independent by New York Stock Exchange standards, but he is who you want on that board. So we are going to talk today about what does independence mean in Latin America. I hope we'll also talk about risk. And what does it mean for boards to provide oversight of risk? Should you have a risk committee? Should the audit committee look at risk also? How does a board look at risk? I hope we will look at family companies and how they have succession planning for the next generation. This is a big question across all of Latin America, where family companies are prominent. I hope we will talk about founder companies. This is perhaps my favorite picture. It comes from Facebook. And I think it speaks about the anxiety that every parent has to allow their children to be free and independent. And this speaks also to the question of founders who simply cannot let go, right? So I hope we'll talk about founder companies today. And then I think we should talk a little bit, because we have regulators and policymakers here on the panel, to talk a little bit about investors. We don't have any investors in the room, I don't think, but these are the people who will vote and decide who sits on boards. They're the owners of companies, but increasingly they are very short term. Today we have investors who will hold your shares for a microsecond and then sell it. What does that mean for corporate governance? So these are some of the questions I hope we ask our panel to talk about. They're difficult questions, and so we're very honored and lucky to have three amazing people who are not afraid of any difficult questions. So let me introduce them to you now. And I'll start with, to my left, Luciana Diaz, who comes to us from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Luciana is a practicing lawyer and a law professor at the Law School of Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Did I say that right? All right.
Almost there.
Almost there. And as on the board of directors of Unidas, yes, and on the audit committee of B3, which you might better know, it's the new name for the Bovespa, the Brazilian stock exchange, since I think 2016. In addition to that, Luciana was a commissioner on the Brazilian Securities and Exchange Commission, the CVM, for about 4 years until 2015. Was the director of market development there, and was involved with the OECD. In fact, represented Brazil on the governance committee there. So welcome, Luciana. To the left of Luciana, we have Clemente Reyes Retana, who joins us. He was the only one who I think could join us today by car or by metro, because he comes to us from Mexico City. He's CEO of his own consulting firm, Reyes Retana Consultores, offering consulting services across a range of areas, including corporate governance, and is on the board of, I have confirmed, 10 companies. Not all of them are equal. Some are smaller than others, some are larger. We should ask you, when do you sleep? How do you do it? Across a range of industries, including real estate, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, and banks and financial institutions. So quite a range. So we have some great perspective from the regulatory side, from the director's side, the consulting side, and then last but certainly not least, we have Daniel Bloom, who gets the prize today for traveling the farthest. Daniel joins us from Paris, where he's been, I think, for nearly 20 years, but is an American, North American, and he is senior policy analyst at the OECD Corporate Affairs Division in Paris, responsible for a lot of initiatives, but in particular for those dealing with Latin America, and also the OECD Corporate Governance Fact Book, which is not just, of course, Latin America, but everything. But Daniel has been in charge of the Latin American Roundtable on Corporate Governance, which brings together leading enterprises across the region, as well as managing the Latin American Network on Governance of State-Owned Enterprises. So I hope we have time to talk about that too. That wasn't among my pictures, but state ownership is another feature of these markets that makes things somewhat different. The last thing I'll say about Daniel is that Daniel was really involved in helping the reviews for the candidate countries to join the OECD, to accede to the OECD, and has therefore worked with Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, but also Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania in the Baltic. So we can talk to Daniel about what the OECD is looking for when it comes to corporate governance. So you have heard me drone on now for far too long. I will stop. And what I'd like to do is hear from each of our three panelists from their perspective about how they see this panorama of governance. And if I can, Clemente, because you are our gracious host, as someone from Mexico City, please, let's begin with you.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Dan, gracias por la invitación a este foro. Que mi experiencia básicamente es en empresas privadas, tanto listadas en bolsa como no. empresas familiares y de propiedad institucional. Mi intención es tratar de hacer un recorrido muy rápido sobre algunos de los aspectos del gobierno corporativo para poder tener materia de discusión sobre algunos puntos que pueden resultar claves. Todos damos por sentado que institucionalizarse es algo bueno, pero no necesariamente en la decisión de las compañías existe la contestación a estos 4 temas. ¿Para qué me voy a institucionalizar? ¿Cómo lo voy a hacer? ¿Cuál es la estructura que debería de tener? ¿Y cuáles son los modelos y marcos de referencia que pueden hacer que este proceso avance de una manera más certera y rápida? Digamos que en general es aceptado que una compañía busca institucionalizarse desde mi punto de vista para trascender en el tiempo, en términos de agregar valor, mantener fortaleza financiera y competitividad. ¿Cómo hacerlo? Pues adoptando una serie de principios y normas que regulan a sus órganos de gobierno, que básicamente son los accionistas, el consejo y la administración. Esto sin dejar de considerar a todas las partes interesadas y asuntos como responsabilidad civil, medio ambiente o equidad de género incluso. Esta estructura, ¿en qué nos ayuda? Ayuda a clarificar los roles, responsabilidades y obligaciones de cada uno de estos participantes. Normalmente esto parece trivial, pero no lo es. En el caso de las empresas de propiedad familiar, resulta también muy útil tener un foro adicional que es el Consejo Familiar, que permite que los asuntos entre los accionistas, que a la vez son familia, se traten fuera de los asuntos que tienen que ver con la empresa. Ha hecho que los estándares de gobierno corporativo converjan en función del apetito que el país tiene para atraer inversión. Creo que esto ha sido algo bastante bueno. Contamos con un marco legal y regulatorio en el caso de México bastante efectivo, tiene una cierta rigidez en algunos puntos, pero gracias a Dios nuestros supervisores y las autoridades han adoptado el concepto que se hablaba hoy en la mañana de cumplir o explicar, de comply or explain, que esto ayuda muchísimo en términos de ir avanzando con una cierta gradualidad y no imponer un molde rígido que para determinadas empresas puede implicar un esfuerzo muy grande, muy costoso para poder llegar ahí. ¿Cuál es la visión que tienen las empresas respecto a adoptar gobierno corporativo? Bueno, pues Dan ya nos introdujo en algunos de los temas. La más sencilla es dar imagen ante la sociedad, ante sus clientes y proveedores, y sobre todo ante los bancos, que son quienes les prestan para capital de trabajo, que son una empresa seria. Este es un proceso gradual que va avanzando. En algún momento los socios se convencen que puede ser algo muy positivo el complementar la experiencia de ellos y de sus directores con directores externos o independientes que aportan elementos para una mejor toma de decisiones. Posteriormente, digamos, se avanza a que no solo sea oír la opinión o ser aconsejados por los demás, sino establecer un foro de análisis y discusión para mejor toma de decisiones. Normalmente se empieza con planeación estratégica y todo lo que tiene que ver con el alta dirección, es decir, la selección, evaluación y compensación de los directores. Y bueno, llegamos a un último punto de madurez, donde el atractivo en la visión de los socios es poder conseguir capital y financiamiento en condiciones mucho más atractivas, pero a cambio de garantizar un trato igualitario a todos los socios, incluidos los minoritarios, y una instancia para resolver diferencias y conflictos de interés, o incluso prevenir estos últimos. En el caso de las empresas de propiedad familiar, que según algunas mediciones en el caso de México es el 64%, digamos que estos son los aspectos más relevantes para los socios. Como les decía, pues clarifica cuáles son sus roles. El segundo punto que aparece ahí es un punto que se omite en muchos temas académicos y que resulta, a mi juicio, de fundamental trascendencia, es qué es más relevante para el socio, el patrimonio que representa la empresa o la fuente de empleo. Normalmente nuestras empresas se generaron en algún momento con un socio fundador, que a lo mejor tenía un pequeño capital y que realmente su beneficio era, en vez de contratarse en una compañía, trabajar para su propia compañía. Es una pregunta profunda, difícil. Aunque ustedes no lo crean, en empresas bien grandes no se hace de una forma clara. Hay quienes prefieren mantener una armonía familiar a tener ejecutivos de la familia que no desempeñan en la forma adecuada y en consecuencia eso va a implicar una minusvalía hacia su patrimonio. Otro tema importante es ayudarles a los socios y a los directores a tener un compromiso con el conocimiento común y que éste esté estructurado. Normalmente está en la cabeza del socio fundador o de los principales directores las claves que hacen que el negocio sea lo que es y se vuelve, digamos, difícil el tener la actitud de compartirlo. Otro punto tiene que ver, digamos, con el esfuerzo que tienen que realizar para invertir en gente, procesos y sistemas. Es muy común que una compañía invierta en un ERP, por ejemplo, haga una gran inversión de dinero y a la hora de dar mantenimiento, tener que hacer correcciones, pierda de perspectiva la importancia o la trascendencia de mantenerlo actualizado. Lo mismo sucede con el personal, cuando hay una mezcla de personas de la familia y no de la familia, a veces no se distingue lo que es un dividendo o una que podría llamarse prestación al socio de lo que debe ser la remuneración a un ejecutivo. Otro punto creo que valioso para estos accionistas es el reafirmar y complementar los valores empresariales. Normalmente estas empresas, cuando llegan a ser exitosas y tener crecimiento, sí tienen una escala de valores, pero hay que, digamos, trabajar en difundirlos, alinearlos entre toda la compañía y sobre todo lo que mucho se ha platicado, establecer un sistema de ética que permita no solo la difusión, la certificación, sino el hacer del conocimiento cualquier queja o reclamación que ya sean miembros de la cadena de valor o empleados pudieran tener. Otro punto que puede ser un incentivo relevante hacia la empresa familiar es liberar el compromiso de la sucesión. Muchas veces nos encontramos una o hasta dos generaciones que llevaron un negocio y resulta que la siguiente generación escoge dedicarse a temas totalmente distintos, estudian física nuclear o bioquímica y el negocio es de manufactura, no tiene el más mínimo interés en llevarlo. Y bueno, cuando se ha avanzado en temas de gobierno corporativo, el riesgo de que la empresa entre en problemas por no tener el interés adecuado se disminuye sensiblemente. Pasamos ahora ya no solo a ver el concepto de empresas familiares, sino básicamente en dónde está el valor agregado de tener un gobierno corporativo operando. El primero tiene que ver con la definición y seguimiento de la planeación estratégica de largo plazo. Comúnmente nos enfocamos en los retos del siguiente trimestre, en el problema que tuvimos con determinado proveedor o cliente y no le damos el tiempo suficiente para discutir hacia dónde vamos a llegar en el largo plazo. Esto normalmente garantiza una mejor toma de decisiones. Como les decía anteriormente, cuando se tienen miembros independientes que han tenido experiencias similares en otras empresas, se tienen lecciones aprendidas que se pueden aplicar en la empresa. Otro de los aspectos muy relevantes tiene que ver con la evaluación objetiva y sistemática del desempeño de la alta dirección, al mismo tiempo que nos lleve a que tengan una compensación competitiva y justa. Los planes de sucesión cada día se vuelven más relevantes. La rotación de los ejecutivos en las compañías se ha incrementado, en el caso particular de México, de una manera muy relevante. Es difícil ver un director que tenga 8 o 10 años en la misma compañía, y este es un punto que se tiene que atender con anticipación, ya sea preparando cuadros internos, con capacitación interna y externa, o tener muy claro los pasos a seguir en caso de algún ejecutivo relevante que se retire. Otro de los puntos que para mí son más relevantes del gobierno corporativo es el establecer una supervisión mucho más exigente a la ejecución de proyectos y nuevos negocios. Y bueno, pues Dan nos comentaba hace un momento el tema de riesgos, cada día más de moda. Realmente existen pocas compañías que manejen un comité de riesgos dentro de su organización. No tiene que ser un tema de tiempo completo, digamos, pero es algo súper recomendable que ayuda no solo a garantizar temas como los planes de continuidad de negocios o de recuperación de desastres, sino también ante temas reputacionales o de catástrofes. Otro de los apoyos relevantes que significa un valor agregado de tener un gobierno corporativo tiene que ver con el fortalecimiento del control interno. Hemos oído en las discusiones previas pues una gran cantidad de avances que se pretenden dar respecto al reporte de la información financiera de las compañías, pero todo esto parte de que existe un control interno eficaz y oportuno. Otro de los asuntos que también se ha comentado mucho es el que tiene que ver con el compromiso con la transparencia, que sin duda implica un esfuerzo relevante para las compañías, pero es algo que cualquier inversor, cualquier banco o autoridad estarían persiguiendo. Desde el punto de vista de condiciones financieras, el tener normalmente un gobierno corporativo nos proporciona ventajas como tener créditos a un financiamiento más barato, a más plazo. Es decir, cuando realmente un banco en sus análisis valida que existe un consejo que está involucrado en la operación de la compañía y que incluso se puede tener acceso a alguno de sus miembros, les da un mundo mucho más conveniente respecto a las condiciones que pudieran obtener. Y bueno, lo mismo podríamos decir respecto a la oportunidad de atraer capital, ya sea para expandirse o para iniciar diversificación en otras líneas de negocio. De relevancia también resulta la posibilidad de poder invitar a socios estratégicos. Si nosotros contamos con un cierto orden dentro de la casa, dentro de la empresa, va a ser mucho más fácil el que este tipo de iniciativas se puedan capitalizar. Finalmente, y creo que es un tema inherente al capitalismo, pues es la oportunidad de poder monetizar parte o la totalidad del patrimonio en algún momento. Ahora me gustaría referirme un poco a los costos, es decir, más que económicos, son costos cualitativos en los cuales creo que también hay que hacer mucho énfasis. El establecer un gobierno corporativo implica compartir el poder con una estructura distinta, implica tener mucho mayor disciplina que la que normalmente se tiene, y un rubro que a veces es el que más trabajo cuesta, y es la disposición a escuchar. Tenemos en ocasiones compañías que a sus consejos les platican lo que van a hacer, pero realmente no tienen una receptividad respecto a lo que algunos miembros pudiesen aportar. Ya se mencionaba también el tema de la información oportuna, verídica, y ya no solo financiera, sino toda la información relevante del negocio. Otro punto que significa un costo relevante es el elaborar políticas corporativas formales y no el típico manejo por situaciones específicas o ad hoc, que la mayoría y sobre todo en países como el nuestro se dan, sino realmente el comprometerse a hacer unas políticas bien estructuradas, sencillas, que duren en el tiempo. Otro tema tiene que ver con definir qué tipo de consejeros independientes debería de tener. Digo, el libro nos dice que normalmente deberíamos tener a alguien experto financiero y alguien que tuviese experiencia en el core del negocio. Este es un tema bien relevante, es integrar un grupo de trabajo con el cual se deben de tener temas afines. Es algo que se tiene que trabajar y que no siempre se toma con la profundidad suficiente. Otro costo también tiene que ver para la empresa el dar acceso irrestricto a los funcionarios y a la información. Normalmente un CFO de una compañía le dedica un porcentaje relevante de su tiempo a lo que tiene que ver con sus interacciones con el comité de auditoría, con los comités de prácticas societarias y con el consejo. Por último, uno de los costos también bien relevantes es que cuando se determine un área de oportunidad, tiene que existir el compromiso de resolverla. Muchas veces el elefante en el cuarto permanece por mucho tiempo. Ahora, finalmente, desde mi punto de vista, ¿cuáles son los retos para seguir avanzando en que más empresas en nuestro país y en general en la región de América Latina incursionen en el tema del gobierno corporativo? Tiene que ver con convencer al accionista que realmente el balance entre los costos y beneficios es muy favorable. Cuando uno platica con alguno de ellos todo lo que se tiene que trabajar, claro, dentro de un proceso que va a llevar tiempo, tiene que haber una claridad respecto a que a cambio de esto va a recibir todos estos beneficios que se van a materializar en una empresa mejor manejada, que pueda tener un mejor valor de mercado, que tenga costos de financiamiento más bajos, que tenga la oportunidad de aliarse con algunos competidores en temas de una fusión, o que pueda, gracias a la transparencia y el buen manejo, cotizar en bolsa o poder adquirir con apalancamiento otra empresa. Es importante escoger un modelo adecuado de acuerdo a la madurez de la empresa. Originalmente en México la mayoría de los consultores veían una empresa mediana, una empresa pequeña, y querían irse directo a un modelo como si fuese cotizada en bolsa. Duraba una sola cita el sales pitch y ahí terminaba, porque era realmente una cantidad de aspectos a resolver. Es muy relevante escoger este modelo y sobre todo, como apunto ahí, el tener un plan con una gradualidad conveniente. El management de la compañía tiene que cambiar su forma de manejarse. Normalmente tienen una relación con el socio fundador o con el CEO y se pueden comunicar en un pasillo, pueden confiarle a que normalmente ha tomado buenas decisiones y ni le cuentan temas. Este es un aspecto para mí relevante. Bueno, finalmente, como les decía, el lograr un gobierno corporativo que sea eficaz tiene que ver, como les comenté, el que permita que la empresa trascienda en el tiempo, creando valor, con fortaleza financiera y con competitividad. Sin embargo, hoy un consejo tiene que aportar nuevas ideas, tiene que apoyar a que exista un proceso de toma de decisiones flexible y oportuno y, en particular, tener un mayor compromiso hacia los inversionistas y los mercados. Gracias.
Thank you, Clemente. That was excellent, and I thought it was fascinating that you brought up the costs of corporate governance. You know, we often talk about corporate governance as being something that is only something that is 100% good thing. It isn't always. There are costs to being open, to being public. I want to come back later to this question that we have across most markets in Latin America, which is why we see so few listed companies. We have, as you said, I think you said 64% of all companies are family owned. Many of those are private. So we're going to come back to that. But I'd like to pass the baton now over to Daniel, who sees this from a global perspective, looking at policies that encourage companies to take up corporate governance, as Clemente was suggesting, across lots of countries. So, Daniel, from your perspective, what are you seeing?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you also, Clemente, because you've made my job much easier, because you've gone through in detail what corporate governance is and what it means to companies, and why it benefits them. And so I can concentrate on what the OECD looks at, which is really from a public policy perspective. Why does it matter for the larger economy? Why do we think it's important at the OECD? And basically I can sum it up in a few points to say, first of all, that if indeed it does result in better performance of companies, then that will attract investors who are interested in investing in companies that perform well and that they can trust. So if corporate governance is functioning well, you will have trust in the markets, and if investors are investing in those companies, it will raise the value of those companies. That in turn can create a kind of a virtuous circle, because more companies could become interested in coming to the market because the value is increasing if the framework is functioning well. So what keeps us up at night is, how do we influence public policy to serve markets so that they function well, so that companies make use of them, so that companies can grow and economies can grow and benefit all of the population. So that's it in a nutshell. Maybe to begin my presentation, I just am going to take maybe 10 minutes total to cover a few issues. But first, to explain what is the OECD Corporate Governance Committee, because I'm part of the OECD Secretariat that serves this committee. And the committee is basically a committee of policymakers from OECD member countries, which are the most developed economies, but also now, and this is new, all of the G20 countries and members of the Financial Stability Board. So it's not only the OECD members, but also countries like Argentina and Brazil that are part of the G20, and countries that have joined recently like Chile and are very close to joining like Colombia and Costa Rica. So increasingly there's a very strong Latin American voice in the development of these principles of corporate governance, which were just revised and reissued in 2015 and changed their name from OECD Principles of Corporate Governance to G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance. And I want to say that we have it also available in Spanish. I have a few copies here, or you can get it on our website if I run out of copies here. The overarching objective of the Corporate Governance Committee is to contribute to economic efficiency, sustainable growth, and financial stability by improving corporate governance policies and supporting good corporate governance practices. So most of what I do, all of the Secretariat does, and our delegates do, is try to work through the public policy framework, but also with companies, to promote implementation of these principles of corporate governance. As a second standard, we also have guidelines for corporate governance of state-owned enterprises. So, in order to revise these 2015 corporate governance principles, we had to take into account recent developments, and in particular, the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, which, as many will tell you, one of the biggest causes of the failures that led to the financial crisis were corporate governance failures. The OECD report on that issue identified in particular lack of effective frameworks for risk management, incentives that were promoted too much risk-taking in terms of remuneration of board members. The boards themselves, coming back to the issues Dan raised at the beginning, not doing an effective job of understanding the risks that were involved and reviewing it. And finally, the shareholders were also absent to a large extent, not ensuring that they appointed good board members or really played the role of an engaged investor that ideally is needed for a good corporate governance framework to function. Subsequent to that study, the OECD committee decided that it needed to review these issues more in depth, and it looked at these 6 topics, doing comparative reviews on board practices and incentives, the role of institutional investors, the frameworks for ensuring that related party transactions between related parties are not abusive, and that they protect minority shareholder rights, board nomination and election, also the overall framework for effectiveness of enforcement, which is critical, and finally risk management and corporate governance. We took all those inputs together and issued the principles in 2015. But there's a larger backdrop to this issue that also keeps us awake at night, which is the fact that markets are not as active as they used to be, with a notable exception, the top line on the chart, that's China's use of the markets, which have skyrocketed, more than doubled during this period. But in countries such as United States, France, Germany, and United Kingdom, it's been dropping quite dramatically. There are not as many companies going to market, and the companies that do are much larger companies. Fewer smaller companies are using the markets. This next slide illustrates that in more detail. And again, it's just some numbers that you can see on the slide are that in the US, before 2000, the average was 452 companies using IPOs to list on markets to raise funds. By 2010 and 2016, that was just 129 companies a year. In Europe, it's dropped from 349 before 2000 to 225 during the next decade, and in the last 5 years, just 140 companies. So this is a story that's happening in developed markets. It's also happening in terms of, you can see it in terms of data on stock exchanges, where the revenues, if you look at the 2004 graph on the left, the top, the gray line there is what 14% of revenues that they used to get from issuers and listings. Now when you move to the 2014 column, that's dropped to just 8%. Meanwhile, if you look at derivatives markets and OTC markets, getting revenues from those kinds of services, that has risen to 22% of their shares. Stock exchanges needing to make profits because they've demutualized, go where the money is, and they're not really aggressively looking for IPOs to bring to the market. And so that also is having an effect on economic growth. A final slide just to conclude on this trend is to show you that prior, in the first period, 1995 to 2003, 80% of all stock market capital value was in OECD markets. And as of 2008 to 2012, the more recent period that we have data for, it's just 40% from OECD markets and 60% from emerging markets. But while the emerging market share is going up, most of that is coming from Asia, and very little of it comes from Latin America. This slide demonstrates that. The green sections are the amount raised from IPOs in Latin America, and I think it's in 2007, 2008 where you can see big chunks of green, which mostly came from the Novo Mercado boom in Brazil, where they were raising lots of funds on the market. But if you look at the last 3 years on that slide, 2014, 15, 16, you almost can't even see the green anymore. It's become so quiet on the markets here. So what do we propose to do about it? We don't have all the answers. Implementing the G20 OECD principles is one part of that. There are 6 chapters in the principles, just to mention them, though I can't go into detail because we don't have the time. It's ensuring the basis of an effective corporate governance framework is really about the effectiveness of the regulator and the overall framework. The rights and equitable treatment of shareholders and key ownership functions is the second chapter. The third chapter is a new chapter that wasn't there in the old principles, really grappling with the fact that the markets have changed, and now you have many other intermediaries between the investor, the person who gives the money, and the person who actually votes on the shares. It's often a proxy advisor or others. Stock market's nature is also changing, so we have some recommendations in that area. The fourth is on stakeholders, fifth on disclosure and transparency, and the last, but certainly not least, the responsibilities of the board. So how relevant are the principles for Latin American countries? Of course, we believe that they're very relevant because you share the same issues and challenges that OECD markets share, with the concerns about the reduced use of equity finance, the lack of public offerings as part of a global trend. And this relates to a lack of confidence in markets, which, if anything, may have been exacerbated in the last few years with the corruption scandals that have been prominent in the markets here in Latin America, but also elsewhere in Europe, we're having them as well. Good corporate governance can help, but it's not the only answer. When we look at this issue, we also look at tax incentives, other government policies influencing capital markets, the costs of bank financing. But when a country becomes too dependent only on bank finance as the source of finance, when you hit a crisis and the bank finance dries up, the country's stuck. It's really been shown through many studies that having both elements of finance are critical to economic growth and a major factor in emerging economy growth. In Latin America in particular, the role of institutional investors is a challenge because it's so rare to find active institutional investors. We have in Chile, Peru, and Colombia, and Brazil perhaps more active markets, more active investors, Brazil certainly. In some of the others, they're not as active. In Argentina, for example, they nationalized all of the pension funds, so there is no active institutional investors at the moment. And finally, corporate governance of SOEs is a big issue in Latin America, and it's gained a lot of attention. So, just as a last slide, say how the OECD monitors and supports progress in implementing good corporate governance. We do it through our committee, which does these cross-country comparative reviews on issues. The new hot issue, and one that I think will be an issue in Latin America as well, is how do you apply these governance regulations in a proportional way or a more flexible way? Because if companies are scared to come to the market because they don't like regulation, are there filters you can put on to have fewer requirements for smaller companies or for companies with a certain ownership structure where you might treat them differently? So we're looking at case studies and other things for a study that we'll be developing and issuing in the coming year. Dan mentioned the OECD Corporate Governance Fact Book, which I also have a copy of and is available online. It covers 47 jurisdictions. All of the OECD member countries, most of the Latin American countries that I mentioned are in there as well, so you can compare exactly what they're doing across all of the different areas that are relevant to public policy, mainly regulation and also comply and explain corporate governance code policies. And lastly, we have the Latin American Corporate Governance Roundtable and a new task force that we're going to establish in September on Latin American equity market development that looks at these issues that I've just been talking about. And finally, the Latin American Network on Corporate Governance of State-Owned Enterprises, which will meet in Colombia in November. And that's something that meets every year or two as well to promote better governance of state-owned enterprises. So with that, I close.
Thank you, Daniel. I should say, full disclosure, I serve as chairman of the OECD Business Advisory Group to that governance committee, so that's how I know Daniel very well. But Daniel, you've posed some very important questions here. You know, are we seeing a kind of eclipse of equity these days as an asset class? You know, you started to answer this question yourself by saying, you know, companies are frightened or scared of going to the public markets, perhaps because of the cost of being public, perhaps because of all of these governance rules. Or, on the other hand, is it something else? Is it the attractiveness of being private? Is it the oceans of money that we have now available for companies to borrow at very attractive rates? Is it something else? So we're going to come back to those questions later. But I want to pass the baton now over to Luciana. And Luciana, you've been introduced already. I mean, and in that chart about the green sections in 2014, 2008 and 9, represented mostly by what the Bovespa had done with the Novo Mercado. So I think we're interested in hearing from you about, you know, what is, you know, for those of us who don't know about the Novo Mercado, what is it and what's been going on with it lately? Tell us how you see things from Sao Paulo.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll switch to Portuguese because we have arranged that each of us would speak in our own language. A fala do Daniel deixou a minha fala muito mais fácil porque eu vou justamente falar sobre a evolução de governança corporativa no Brasil. O Brasil é um case. Muita gente foi ao Brasil estudar a nossa regulação de governança corporativa e por que isso mudou o cenário do mercado de capitais no Brasil. Então, eu acho que é muito tempestivo falar sobre isso num painel que está discutindo como melhorar tanto o cenário de governança corporativa como o desenvolvimento da região como um todo. O Brasil é um exemplo de que a governança corporativa fez muita diferença para o desenvolvimento do mercado de capitais. E por que isso? Qual era o cenário? The translation's not working.
Yeah, let's stop you just for a moment.
Okay.
Sorry about that. We do have translation. I think we just need to get. Yes? One moment.
I didn't practice in
No,
English, but
it's
I
fine.
can...
We can do it in Portuguese. Okay. Okay. All right. So let's start.
But
Oh, okay. So if you cannot hear it, you should change. No, are you still not getting it? Cat. All right. I'm being told that it should work.
Yes.
ok. Agora está funcionando?
Yes. So please.
Ok.
Yes.
Então, o novo mercado é o exemplo de que governança corporativa pode fazer muita diferença para o mercado de capitais. E também o exemplo de que sentar em cima de um mérito, de alguma coisa que você alcançou, sem investir para que isso seja mantido efetivo, para que isso seja atualizado, pode não significar muito anos depois, que o trabalho de governança corporativa é um trabalho contínuo, perpétuo, de rediscutir as bases de administração das companhias. Bom, qual era o cenário do Brasil em 2000? Quando o mercado brasileiro começou a pensar sobre governança corporativa. A gente tinha tido uma série de flexibilizações na regra societária para facilitar as privatizações que deterioraram os direitos dos minoritários. Então, o governo federal, para ganhar mais dinheiro com as privatizações, flexibilizou a lei numa série de aspectos que fizeram com que os investidores confiassem menos no mercado brasileiro. Diante desse cenário, um estudo foi encomendado e essa percepção dos investidores foi documentada, não era uma adivinhação, era algo que se podia perceber dos estudos que foram encomendados à época. Governança corporativa era um fator. Então, a Bolsa de Valores de São Paulo, na época, a Bovespa, estudou e implementou durante 2 anos alguns segmentos de listagem, 3 segmentos de listagem, com regras de governança corporativa mais estritas que as legais. E o segmento mais alto se chama Novo Mercado, e é por isso que a gente fala em geral sobre ele. As regras que eu vou dar como exemplo, que foram as mais importantes sob o meu ponto de vista, vocês vão ver que hoje em dia elas não significam mais nada, mas na época foi o que fez o Brasil sair de um mercado absolutamente inoperante para um mercado ativo com um bom significativo nos anos de 2007 e 2008. Por exemplo, a gente hoje adota o IFRS, mas à época a gente adotava regras contábeis num padrão nacional que eram quase que uma não linguagem para aqueles investidores que vinham de fora. Então, o novo mercado, uma das regras primordiais era fazer as demonstrações financeiras em US GAAP e traduzi-las para o inglês, que hoje em dia já não significa mais nada, porque está todo mundo migrado para o IFRS, mas naquela época talvez tenha sido uma das regras mais importantes do novo mercado. Outra coisa que foi importante foi todos os membros do Conselho de Administração têm que ser eleitos na mesma data. Existia uma série de regras na lei para você ter uma representatividade dos minoritários no Conselho, mas o que os controladores faziam era eleger um membro do Conselho por ano, de modo que eles sempre tinham a maioria para eleger todos os membros do Conselho. Você tem um Conselho que se elege todo ao mesmo tempo, que é uma regra muito simples, fez muita diferença naquele cenário que a gente vivia em 2000. Só que essas regras deixa eu terminar esse slide, eu falo sobre as regras depois. Ao mesmo tempo, em 2010, a CVM fez um avanço imenso em termos de transparência. O novo mercado trata um pouco de transparência, mas eram poucas coisas que ele falava. Ele falava de transações com partes relacionadas e de regras contábeis. Então, em 2010, com uma lei de 2007, a gente migrou para o IFRS gradualmente até 2011 e as informações qualitativas foram alteradas pela CVM em 2010. Então, um corpo de informações foi trazido para os níveis internacionais em 2010. Bom, dito isso, o que permanecia, ou depois de 2010, o que permanecia um problema? O novo mercado não conseguia avançar. Então, de 5 em 5 anos, a Bolsa faz uma reavaliação das regras e propõe para as companhias do novo mercado que essas regras sejam modificadas, sejam alteradas. 1/3 das companhias não pode votar contra para essas regras passarem. Então, se as companhias se organizam e mais de 1/3 vota contra, as regras não passam. Quando que as companhias adotam a regra do novo mercado? As companhias, em geral, adotam a regra do novo mercado quando elas fazem uma emissão de valores mobiliários, quando elas estão fazendo o IPO delas. Naquele momento, elas querem captar dinheiro. Elas olham para as regras do novo mercado e falam, olha, se para captar nesse múltiplo eu preciso adotar isso, eu adoto. Não necessariamente é uma companhia madura que refletiu substancialmente sobre as regras de governança e acredita na melhor governança corporativa como um valor da companhia. É uma exigência do mercado para você adquirir certos múltiplos na oferta pública. Então, o diálogo de renovação das regras do novo mercado é sempre um diálogo muito difícil. Você tem as companhias mais maduras e mais engajadas em governança corporativa, mas você tem aquelas que fizeram a opção pelo novo mercado no momento da oferta e elas simplesmente não estão dispostas a evoluir. As maiores companhias, na época, estatais, então, há 3 anos, a gente está... O início das reformas que eu vou descrever daqui para frente tem mais ou menos uns 3 anos, as companhias estatais estavam envolvidas em escândalos de corrupção bastante graves. Então, você tinha, de um lado, uma defasagem das regras do novo mercado e escândalos de corrupção nas companhias estatais. Diante desse cenário, houve um movimento muito grande do mercado exigindo reformas, para discutir reformas. Ele foi primeiro muito focado nas companhias estatais e depois se estendeu para as companhias não estatais. Bom, em relação às companhias estatais, o que aconteceu nos últimos 3 anos? A gente tem 2 fatos ou 2 iniciativas bastante voltadas para as companhias estatais. A primeira é que a B3, que é a Bolsa, formulou um programa de qualidade para a governança dessas companhias. É diferente de um segmento de listagem, é mais parecido com um selo. Então, a companhia submete uma série, responde a uma série de perguntas e submete uma série de documentos. E, a depender da nota que ela tem numa série de quesitos, a Bolsa dá um carimbo de qualidade. E esse slide já está desatualizado, porque no Jornal do Brasil, hoje, 2 companhias estatais muito importantes aderiram ou estão no processo de adesão. Então, elas submeteram os documentos e os questionários para a Bolsa avaliar, que é a Petrobras, que é essa companhia que estava envolvida em corrupção, e a administração foi toda renovada, e hoje em dia ela está sendo profissionalmente gerida. Óbvio que os problemas da Petrobras são muito mais profundos do que a composição do conselho, mas hoje em dia tem gente trabalhando para que ela esteja num melhor lugar, e uma das coisas que eles estão fazendo aplicando, né, se candidatando a esse selo, então eles fizeram o trabalho, e o Banco do Brasil. O jornal de hoje está com essa notícia, que os dois pediram a Bolsa para que eles fossem avaliados e vão aderir ao programa de governança. E uma outra coisa que aconteceu foi a edição de uma lei, que é o Estatuto Jurídico da Empresa Estatal. A lei tem uma série de normas, mas eu acredito que os dois grupos de normas que são mais importantes para a governança corporativa são um grupo de normas ligados a controles internos. Então, toda empresa estatal de um certo porte e todas as listadas que interessam para o mercado têm que atender a esses requisitos, tem que ter uma função de compliance, tem que ter uma função de auditoria interna, tem que ter um comitê de auditoria que cumpra certos requisitos de independência. E o outro grupo de normas que é bastante importante é relacionado à indicação dos administradores dessas companhias. Era muito comum, até 3 anos atrás, você ter um ministro de Estado, um secretário de Estado sentado no conselho de administração dessas companhias. As companhias até gostavam de ter essas pessoas, não só pelo prestígio que elas traziam, mas porque facilitava a vida delas no contato com o governo, né? A maior parte delas é prestadora de serviços públicos e elas achavam que ter o ministro lá já facilitava a conversa com o ministério, que elas tinham que conversar anyways. Então, esse foi um marco bastante importante. Ele não só impediu que ministros de Estado sentassem nos conselhos e na diretoria, mas essa vedação abrange pessoas que exerceram funções decisórias em partidos políticos nos últimos 36 meses, diretor sindical, pessoas que têm ligações com deputados. Então, mais ou menos, eu não diria que blindou os cargos administrativos de estatais, mas, pelo menos, as pessoas que serão indicadas, ainda que seja uma indicação política, terão que cumprir com certos requisitos, e alguns deles técnicos. Elas têm que ter, no mínimo, 10 anos de experiência na área da empresa ou 4 anos numa área de direção, e também alguns requisitos de independência em relação ao governo. O que não é blindar, mas é melhorar substancialmente a qualidade dos conselhos dessas companhias. Em relação às companhias privadas, a gente teve 2 movimentos bastante importantes, que foi o Código Nacional de Governança. O Código Nacional de Governança é um documento elaborado por 11 instituições, que vai ser adotado, está no processo de discussão, de audiência pública, como ele vai ser adotado pela Comissão de Valores Mobiliários, pela CVM, que é o regulador local. E aí a discussão se é incorporada dentro, é um código de comply or explain, se ela é incorporada dentro dos formulários que já existem hoje, se ela vai ser um formulário à parte, de quanto em quanto tempo isso vai ter que ser revisado, mas existe hoje uma discussão de como incorporar. Ela vai ser incorporada, esse código foi feito para ser incorporado. Como isso vai acontecer, ainda está em aberto, mas vai ser incorporado. E a gente está no meio da votação de alterações para o novo mercado. Então, de novo, depois de uma revisão, a Bovespa, a antiga Bovespa, hoje B3, fez uma proposta de alteração, e essas alterações foram debatidas com o mercado de diversas formas, em audiências privadas, em audiência pública, e agora eles estão no meio do processo de votação. Eles dividiram esse processo de votação em algumas partes, um núcleo básico de modificações e 4 outras modificações que podem ser votadas à parte. Da última vez eles fizeram isso também, dividiram, você podia votar em cada proposta. E as propostas importantes todas ficaram de fora. Eles usaram uma estratégia um pouco diferente dessa vez. Eles colocaram as propostas que eles entendem que são core, que são importantes dentro de uma de um corpo único, e aí eles têm algumas que são, para eles, menos importantes ou mais polêmicas e podiam botar abaixo toda a reforma e fizeram votações separadas. Mas a gente está no meio do processo de votação disso. Como vocês veem, as reformas para as companhias estatais estão mais consolidadas do que as reformas para as companhias privadas. Qual a reação disso? Bom, a reação para as companhias estatais foi, eu diria, bastante positiva. Não só você tem algumas adesões já para o programa pro programa de destaque da Bolsa, que é o programa de qualidade de governança corporativa da empresa estatal, que é um processo lento mesmo. O Novo Mercado foi um processo lento, então, mas você tem duas companhias importantes já dispostas a aderir, conversa com N outras companhias. E, independente das críticas que existem ao estatuto jurídico da empresa pública, o mercado, em geral, acredita que é um avanço importante. Que não tem uma pessoa no mercado que não admita que é um avanço. Ainda que alguns achem que podia ser mais ousado, outros acham que podia ser mais flexível, outros acham que não levou tudo que devia levar em consideração, todos acreditam que foi um passo importante. Então, eu acho que a reação foi bastante positiva. Em relação às companhias privadas, tem sido mais polêmico. O Código de Governança Nacional é acusado e apontado por muita gente como um documento muito grande, muito detalhado e longe da realidade da maior parte das empresas. Ele foi discutido com 11 entidades que colocaram seus representantes, não necessariamente as pessoas que tomam as decisões, os decision makers. Então, para quem está familiarizado com a literatura de governança corporativa, são princípios bastante comuns, só que não necessariamente eles conversam com o status quo da governança corporativa no Brasil hoje. Para todas as companhias a que eles se aplicarão. Ele vai se aplicar para todo mundo que é listado no Novo Mercado e que é listado nos segmentos tradicionais que têm padrões de governança corporativa inferiores ao do Novo Mercado. Então, existe uma resistência ao Código Nacional de Governança Corporativa e essa estratégia da Bolsa de fatiar a votação dos avanços do Novo Mercado em diferentes votações já resultou no passado em aprovação daquilo que não era importante e não aprovação daquilo que é importante. Eles melhoraram o procedimento, mas ainda é possível que coisas importantes fiquem de fora. E, aliás, é possível, inclusive, que a reforma não venha a ser aprovada, o que é uma coisa muito difícil para o mercado brasileiro, que está sendo cobrado, porque as regras do Novo Mercado já não são mais um padrão aceitável de governança para empresas de um determinado porte. Então, enquanto para as companhias estatais a gente vê alterações que foram mais bem-sucedidas, eu acho, a gente ainda precisa testar essas alterações para as companhias privadas para ver se elas são implementadas de uma maneira efetiva. As duas ainda estão no processo de implementação, de discussão, e se elas realmente agregam valor para o framework de governança corporativa no Brasil. Eu agradeço, peço desculpas já por ter me estendido um pouco mais.
Thank you, Luciana. I will tell you, the Brazilian model, the Novo Mercado model, is one that a lot of countries have looked at and have tried to duplicate, to emulate. I know China looked at it, I know Bulgaria looked at it, and no one seems to have been able to do what you have done in Brazil. So, I think one question we'd love from you in this panel, perhaps, is, why do you think it worked in Brazil? And maybe for Daniel, you too, who look across all of these countries. I'm interested from each of you, this question of, how do we sell governance to companies, and what seems to work? What seems to convince companies that, yes, corporate governance is something I want to do to improve? So we don't have a lot of time, and so instead of asking lots of little questions, I want to ask you one big question, and that is, how do we sell governance? How do we convince companies that this is useful, important, good for markets. And you can take this from any perspective you like. So Luciana, you spoke a lot from the perspective of a regulator or a policymaker, but we didn't hear much from you about your role as director of Unidas, is that right?
Yes.
So you're a director as well. Daniel, I know you've worked with a lot of countries that have adopted better governance, like Malaysia, which started out quite low in terms of governance strength and now is much better. And Clemente, I'd love your perspective on how do we sell this idea of governance to Mexican companies so that they can we can have more listed companies here. So, I don't know, Daniel, you're smiling. I'll start with you.
Okay. Well, before I talk about Malaysia, because probably I can't talk about Malaysia, the example that's closer to home is the Latin American Company Circle, which was established by the Roundtable and brought together about 14 leading companies, many of them from Brazil, but from about 6 or 7 different countries. And they were considered leaders in their market in terms of committing to high standards of corporate governance. And we did a study after this company circle was established in 2005, and it's still in existence today. It's now the IFC that's the sponsor of this group, and the OECD is less involved. But at the beginning, we did a study and issued a report called the Company Circle Practical Guide to Corporate Governance, which looked at the data results over time of these companies compared to other companies in Latin America and globally. And in terms of their stock market price and many other factors, 5 or 6 different things that we measured, they performed far better. And that in itself is a very powerful message. They went around to events all over Latin America and in the US as well, saying corporate governance works. Right. And it wasn't just a case of performing better during the up times. It was also during the crisis that they didn't go as far down during the crisis period.
So the argument is better performance and higher resilience.
Yes.
Right? Okay, very interesting. What about you? What do you think?
I think in the Brazilian case, who bought corporate governance was institutional investors and bankers, not the companies. So Novo Mercado is the example of that. You sell to the investors that this framework will be better for their investment. And that's why it's hard to move along or to move up, because companies are not, they want the investors, and so sadly I think it's very hard to sell corporate governance to companies in the way we see that, in the way we discuss the corporate governance principles, but I think it's much easier to sell to whoever is involved in the moment of the issuance.
Right.
So
demand for better governance. Now, one other thing, you mentioned bankers, that they at the beginning were very supportive. How in what way were they lending money? They
would refuse to do any offer outside of Novo Mercado.
Really?
They say it's too hard to sell, and even today it's almost impossible unless you have a good reason. For regulatory reasons you cannot be in Novo Mercado. For example, Novo Mercado requires 1 share, 1 vote. If you have a good reason not to have 1 share, 1 vote, if you are an airplane company, or if you are a telecommunication company, you have to have the controller shareholder being a Brazilian. So you have to have preferred shares you don't have to have, but most of the companies opt to have preferred shares or non-voting shares in their capital structure. So they can issue without being in the Novo Mercado. But I think who bought corporate governance in Brazil were investors and bankers more than companies.
Fascinating. Now, you're a director on several banks. I mean, what do you...
Así es. Bueno, hay un tema cultural también bien importante. En el caso de nuestros mercados, normalmente hay un grupo que controla la empresa. La cultura de tener socios desconocidos no es sencillo. Es decir, el origen de las empresas en los países anglosajones implica la participación de grupos diversos de accionistas desde una etapa muy temprana. En México es algo que no sucede, el miedo a perder el control. Realmente, por ejemplo, en nuestra bolsa solo hay 3 o 4 empresas en las que el grupo de control no es mayoritario. Entonces, sí hay muchos temas vistos desde el otro lado, ¿no?, en los que hay que seguir trabajando. Las nuevas generaciones ven las cosas distintas, pero todavía los que toman las decisiones ven obstáculos o aspectos desconocidos que los hacen ser mucho más cuidadosos o resistentes.
And they're not going to be convinced by the arguments that Daniel has made about resiliency or performance, right? I mean, we got one of the questions from the audience here is there a correlation between good governance and stock price, right? I think this is the perennial, this is sort of like the question everyone wants the answer to, the holy grail, right, of corporate governance. Can you show a connection? What do you,
in Brazil,
yeah.
there is.
There is in Brazil.
We keep track of the performance of the companies that are in Novo Mercado and the companies that are not, and there is evidence that the companies in Novo Mercado perform better.
That would seem to convince, me, I would be convinced by that.
En México no necesariamente.
It's not necessarily
Es
the
decir,
case. Yes.
si no hay una oportunidad de expandirse o desarrollar nuevos negocios para lo que requieran capital,
Right.
no necesariamente una empresa de propiedad familiar institucionalizada es menos buena que una empresa que cotiza en bolsa.
But the other point I think that's not often made is we're operating today in an environment of larger and larger companies. To compete regionally, globally, you need size, you need scale, you must need capital, and so there must be limitations to grow. And so where is that boundary where you say, okay, I will let go of some control in order to grow? I don't know. Daniel, you were also trying to get in there.
Yeah, well, I wanted to talk still also about selling corporate governance. It's not just to the companies or to the minority shareholders, it's the owners. And we talked about state-owned enterprises, who are also controlling owners, and very often are reluctant to implement practices that will release some control or make things more transparent where they have less control. But then you have the situation that you have now in Brazil, where people are not confident in the markets because of the scandal that they've faced because of poor SOE governance.
Yeah.
And I think that Luciana gave the example of this stock exchange initiative to create a special reward, but it's not the SOEs themselves who can volunteer to join that. They have to convince the owners, the government, to go along with it. And that's not necessarily easy, but when you see the downside of how the markets just have not been doing well in Brazil for the most part. They've had some ups and downs. Yeah. But it just seems clear, even from this larger perspective, that it's having a negative impact on the capital market growth, even if you're not looking at individual companies, but just on the prospects for the market as a whole.
Right. And sorry, go ahead.
In the case of Mexico, private equity funds are being a bridge between private companies and the market, and this has been growing in a steady rhythm.
Yes, and I don't know if you have private equity, and it must have huge in Brazil. But this is, and in my country too, this is the other side. You have companies who say, I don't want to be public. I don't need the aggravation. I can get money from private equity.
Private equity firms have the way out, right?
Yes.
And for that, active market's important. So although we have a lot of money from private equity in Brazil, they also are worried about how to realize their investments, and for that market is important, because at a certain size there's a limit of buyers for those equity shares, right?
Yeah. And they need an exit strategy. They need to go back. Okay. I think we have one or two more questions, and then we're going to try and do this experiment and get you a bit more involved. You'll have to help me with the Spanish.
Como podemos lograr?
¿Cómo podemos lograr que el gobierno corporativo funcione en el sector público
Yeah.
cuando predominan ciertos grupos de interés en perjuicio de la ciudadanía?
Who wants to take that?
No, I mean, we. I don't know if we have already everything fixed in Brazil, but I think the recent scandals helped us to put together a minimum framework for those companies to be separate from government. So, of course, they are the controlling shareholders and they will influence companies, but what they cannot is to take the companies inactive. It was just an arm of the government in the market. And so now we have some kind of rules on who you can appoint to those boards and what kind of requirement those people have to comply with. And it's a more technical way of choosing who are on those boards.
And also, the OECD does have recommendations about state ownership, corporate governance, and one of the ones that is my favorite recommendation is that a country with a lot of state-owned companies should create a holding company for those assets. There should be no direct telephone call between the ministry and the people on the board. There should be a holding company that holds the assets and has as its single objective to raise the value of the shares of that enterprise. If you have social objectives, those should be placed somewhere else in the ministry. I mean, I love that. I think that's a very common sense recommendation. And am I correct, Daniel, that there is a whole series of recommendations that you make for SOE governance? You have your own guidelines that are separate to the principles, right?
Yes, and they're just as detailed as the principles of corporate governance, but they say that the SOEs should also follow the principles of corporate governance, but there's a whole other different element with the state being the owner. Not necessarily through a holding company, that's one way to do it, but also through a centralized agency of some kind that exercises the role and separates the worries of the sectoral ministries, keeps that separate, so they don't have that conflict of interest. Yeah.
Very good. So we have about 15 minutes left. I want to do this experiment. We want to get you involved in the discussion. Thank you for your questions. But what we have for you are two questions we want you to talk about as two groups, one on this side, one on this side. We'll see if this works. If you like another question, you can stand up and you can move to the other side. And you can divide into language groups if you like. We'll see how it works. It'll be in a little bit of an experiment. But these are the two questions, and I don't think we have them on the slide, unfortunately. So for this side of the room, we want you to talk about this question we have been discussing. What is the single one thing that your country, that your market could do to increase investor confidence in the quality of governance? What is the one thing you could do to improve governance quality, improve confidence, confianza, right? And then on this side, we want you to talk about this question of how do we get companies themselves to be, what Luciana was saying, that the trouble is companies cannot be convinced. So the question is, how do we get companies interested to be listed, to go public, and to seek a listing? Right? So those are the two questions. You can get up and move if you like. We want to take 5 or 6 minutes, not very long. Try and see what you come up with. Okay? Let's see if it works.
You can move your chairs around if you need to.
And yes, and then try and nominate a speaker to just tell us what you thought. Or, yes. So you can move your chairs. You can move your chairs around and talk. All right. Let's give them a few minutes. Bit of an experiment. You guys are great. Excellent.
Thanks, enjoyed it.
I thought it was good discussion. What I want them to do is to give us one or two ideas, and then if we have time for you to reply. Yeah. Okay. This was a difficult question. So does that mean how do we get governance to work for state-owned companies when there's a predominates groups of interests I don't understand that last part. Is that about just the social?
Prejudice, prejudice of citizenship.
Oh, it's like social question. Like,
No, it's like if those groups are not thinking about the good of the people, and
Yes.
they are thinking about their own good. So how can you have good corporate governance in the state-owned enterprise if you are not thinking the good of the people?
Yes. The good of the ministry or the good of the government or private interest. Yeah, it's fine.
The message wasn't ready, no estaba listo, entonces
Okay, it's fine.
estamos un poco apenados con ustedes,
Por supuesto.
pero bueno, les vamos a dar un reconocimiento ahora al final a los cuatro.
A las cuatro.
Terminando,
Sí.
a los cuatro.
Sí. I will try and keep it right at 4. Okay. Bueno.
Gracias.
Gracias a usted. Okay, just take 1 or 2 more minutes to conclude, and we want to hear from a few groups.
And so the code says, if you adopt this practice, explain why. And the reason is the law allows you to do that, and it's a good way to ensure that the CEO or the CFO is a person I trust. But it's uncomfortable to be in the position that you have to explain because the code says that the other way is a better corporate governance practice. So that's the type of criticism.
I know. Do we have to do those? No, but we do have them. Okay. And all right. Okay. Okay. I think we're gonna. I know you're in the middle of some good conversations, but if we can ask you to bring those to a conclusion, we want to hear. Oops. All right, we just have a few more minutes left, so we want to hear from a few groups. This group seems to have the most organized, vivo, really vibrant conversation. So can we get one person to stand up? Español, Portugués, Inglés, it's fine. Just tell us what you're talking about. And we have a microphone for you. So can we give the microphone to this gentleman? Yes? Please, just tell us what you're... Yes.
Exacto. Gracias
Buenas tardes.
por darnos la oportunidad. Y excelente panel. Hemos conversado aquí en el grupo sobre el gobierno corporativo en las instituciones y hemos puesto algunos ejemplos. Y hay que ver el gobierno corporativo de adentro hacia afuera también, porque hemos visto compañías, por ejemplo, que han tenido un gobierno corporativo, han tenido un gobierno corporativo muy organizado hacia adentro. Inclusive, ese gobierno corporativo ha creado su departamento de soborno adentro y lo ha manejado muy bien. Ahora, hacia adentro, hacia afuera, ¿dónde está la ética? Que ese es el elemento que nosotros debemos pregonar en este evento. ¿Cuál es la ética de ese gobierno corporativo? Porque no se concibe, excúseme que se oye muy duro, porque tú sabes que los viejitos hablamos duro porque creemos que lo oímos. No se concibe una empresa organizada, dígase un banco, dígase una organización, por ejemplo, como una cervecería internacional, vamos a decir como Ambés, como una compañía que tiene capitales de otras compañías, no se concibe en este tiempo sin un gobierno corporativo. Y si realmente esa compañía no tiene ese gobierno corporativo, es porque muchas veces esa compañía está gobernada por un capital mayormente familiar, y el gobierno corporativo de esa empresa y la familia, que muchas veces no hacen caso ni siquiera a un comité de auditoría que existe dentro de su entorno. Esa es la conclusión que no tenemos. No lo concebimos, una compañía organizada sin un gobierno corporativo. Y segundo, si esa compañía no tiene ese gobierno corporativo, porque quizás no tiene un capital diversificado.
Very good. So governance as a precondition, really, for being an organized company, and then a plea for ethics as well. But I'm going to ask our panel to quickly sort of react, but before that, anybody from the other side of the house? Matt, or a gentleman? Yes.
Yes. Okay, this is on. We actually decided to change the question based on what Luciano said. You need to convince the investor, not the company. So what the goal should be is to get institutional and individual investors to see the benefits of a listed company and the protections it affords with a more transparent framework, minority shareholder rights, et cetera, that goes with corporate governance. And then to withhold the capital from those companies that are not willing to enter and be a listed entity.
Right.
So instead of trying to convince the company, as long as the company can continue to raise capital without being listed, they don't have any real incentive to be more transparent or be subject to anything else. So we say go talk to the investors, let the investors know, especially with long-term sustainable growth, that you might not see in a more closed, non-listed entity.
So a plea for work with investors and getting them involved. I want you to ask each of you to just give us your final reaction and sort of summing up thoughts in 30 seconds or less. But before we do that, and to give you time to think, we have some final polling questions for you. Let's see if we can do this. Or are they not here? No? Maybe we didn't load them. Oh well. Forget our polling questions. That's for next time. So you don't get much time to think about it. 30 seconds or less. I'd love just your final thoughts, reacting to this idea of an ethical imperative, governance as a precondition, and then the investor angle.
Okay, the problem is always more complex. Some companies, some investors have no option they have, especially if you are a portfolio investor, a passive portfolio investor, you have no option to be exposed to certain companies. For example, Ambev is not in Novo Mercado because they think they don't need to be in Novo Mercado. If you want to be exposed to the Brazilian market, you need to buy Ambev, you need to buy Petrobras, you need to buy all those companies that have not that good governance, but they are big enough to be in an index, and so many investors have to buy their stocks. So there's a limit on how convincing investors. It's very effective when companies are medium size, small and medium size, but not that effective with big companies. And I will leave you with a problem, not with a solution.
On that pessimistic note, Clemente.
Bueno, sin duda la cultura tanto de los accionistas controladores como de los inversionistas es un tema fundamental, y como apunta Luciana, hay un montón de dimensiones desde el cuales verlas. El tema de la transparencia tiene el riesgo de esclarecer demasiado una estrategia determinada que se puede pensar es una ventaja competitiva, y ahí entra uno a temas bastante complejos. Sin duda una empresa que no tiene una, digamos, agresividad por crecer, difícilmente va a entrar en un proceso de este tipo, porque sí, el asumir estos riesgos de transparencia y de sentar a un desconocido en tu consejo tienen su impacto.
Yeah.
También los dejo más con dudas que con respuestas.
So again, a word of caution. Things are slightly more complicated than they appear. Daniel.
Well, I would say to companies that I would start from the angle of adopting better corporate governance practices. You get 2 for 1, because the first thing you get is better performance as a result of the better corporate governance practices. But at the same time, you get access to free money. I mean, it's free if you're adopting the corporate governance standards not as much to attract as investors as much as to improve performance. Then, in that sense, the money you get from either listing on the market or getting money from private equity is money that you don't have to pay back. You can use it to grow. So those are the arguments I would give, which both go in the same direction. I don't think that private equity is an enemy to developing a listed company market, because companies need to adopt good corporate governance practices also for private equity, and as they grow further, they may see the benefits of listing. So it can be a step in the same direction. And on the investor side, I think working with Costa Rica recently, because they're trying to join the OECD, which is gave me a new perspective a little bit on what's critical for investors, because shares are so little traded there that once an investor is in the market, it's very hard to get out.
Yeah.
And I think that liquidity is something that we haven't mentioned. It's not really a corporate governance issue per se, but it's critical that the governance, that the market requirements encourage this kind of liquidity in trading, so that investors, if they don't like what they're getting, they can get out and they don't get ripped off. They can sell their shares at a market price.
So these broader market questions, liquidity certainly is one of them. I think we'll have to wait for our next panel. I don't know that we convinced everyone, but I hope have given you all something to think about. It leaves just for me to ask each of you to thank muchísimas gracias to our wonderful panel, to Clemente, to Luciana, to Daniel. Please join me in saying thank you. Think you will enjoy this.
Gracias.
Que disfruta.
Gracias, un pequeño reconocimiento.
Gracias.
Danilo.
Por el pequeño.
Terrific.
Yes, yes.
Luciana, thank you very much.
This company just became public.
Is that right?
That's a good sign.
1 month ago.
It's a tequila. Yes. Clemente tells us that the Oh. Clemente tells us that the tequila company that produces this just went public 1 month ago. How about that?
This was for you. Thank you very much.
Okay, gracias.
Ya tenemos tequila.
Clemente.